All she wanted was to get to her grandmother. A 5-year-old girl with a ticket and papers was at the center of humiliation, questioning, and ridicule, just because her name seemed too weird for business class. But when her mother arrived at the airport, the legendary champion staff were shocked. Subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're watching this video from. The sun had barely risen above the Los Angeles skyline when the soft sound of drawers opening and suitcases zipping echoed through the quiet house. In the softly lit hallway, the faint scent of lavender and oatmeal drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the sound of bare feet pattering against the hardwood floor. Ronda Rousey, barefoot in leggings and a faded UFC hoodie, knelt beside a pink and purple suitcase, carefully folding a miniature hoodie into the corner of the bag. The name stitched on the inside read, La'akea Makalapuo Kalanipu Brown. She smoothed the fabric with one hand, then reached for a pair of child-sized sneakers sitting nearby. La'akea, only 5 years old, stood in the doorway, holding her plush unicorn with one arm and rubbing her eyes with the other. Her long hair was slightly tangled from sleep, and she wore a soft blue shirt with a rainbow on the front and tiny hearts dotting her pajama pants. She looked up at her mother, blinking slowly as if trying to understand how today had arrived so quickly. Ronda smiled and stood, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Big day," she said gently, then kissed the top of her head. "You ready, superstar?" La'akea nodded wordlessly and hugged her unicorn tighter. Despite her young age, there was something quietly observant about her, as though she had inherited her mother's cautious reading of the world around her. Her eyes, a deep brown like her father's, held curiosity wrapped in calm. The reason for this early morning rush was simple, yet significant. Ronda and her husband, Travis Brown, were committed to an intense filming schedule for a fitness and action docuseries, and a last-minute opportunity had shifted everything. With Travis already on location in Arizona and Ronda expected on set by noon, the couple had agreed, after much discussion, that it was time for La'akea's first solo flight. It wasn't entirely solo, of course. The airline's unaccompanied minor program was thorough. A designated airline representative would escort La'akea through every step of the process: check-in, security, boarding, and disembarkation. Her grandmother would meet her at the gate in Seattle. Every precaution had been taken. Her seat in business class had been booked with priority clearance. Her documents were double-checked, including a notarized letter from Ronda authorizing the travel. The staff had been notified in advance. Still, Ronda's hands trembled slightly as she fastened the latches on the suitcase. It wasn't about safety. It was about absence. The first time her daughter would be in the air without her, even if just for 2 hours. At the airport, the usual clamor of travelers was already building. The early flights drew frequent flyers, business travelers, and families squeezing in vacations. The air inside the terminal buzzed with energy and fatigue. Ronda, sunglasses tucked into her shirt and a baseball cap low over her brow, held La'akea's hand tightly as they moved through the sliding glass doors of Terminal 6. Everything went smoothly at first. The check-in agent recognized Ronda, but didn't make a scene. The documents were verified. The pink, unaccompanied minor tag was attached to La'akea's tiny backpack, and a friendly airline escort, a woman named Julie, was introduced to take over. Ronda knelt to look her daughter in the eyes one last time, checking her shoelaces and straightening her unicorn's ribbon. "You remember what we talked about?" she asked softly. La'akea nodded. "I stay with Julie the whole time. I sit in seat 2A. I don't talk to strangers unless they wear airport clothes, and I call Grandma when I land." Ronda smiled proudly. Exactly. And what do you do if you get scared? Laakea paused. Think of home, then breathe like Mama taught me. They embraced, long and firm, before Ronda whispered, You got this. She stood back as Julie took Laakea's hand and began guiding her through the priority security lane. Ronda stood watching until they disappeared from view, her heart heavy with pride and apprehension. The journey from the check-in counter to the boarding gate was supposed to be simple, even pleasant. But trouble often begins not with malice, but with assumptions. As they approached the TSA checkpoint, Julie received a call from the airline dispatch. A last-minute emergency in another terminal required her attention. She hesitated. Policy required uninterrupted supervision of minors, but the man who approached her, wearing the official airport staff vest and carrying a tablet, assured her he was cleared to take over. His name tag read D. Sims. He smiled in a way that barely touched his eyes and gestured for Julie to hand the child over. Julie hesitated but eventually relented. Everything seemed legitimate. She explained the situation to Laakea, who nodded, clutching her unicorn and holding the replacement escort's hand. Sims led her towards the screening area, entering a line reserved for business-class travelers. It was here, with no mother by her side and no one to speak on her behalf, that the trajectory of Laakea's morning began to shift. As Sims approached the checkpoint with Laakea, another TSA employee, an officer named Dave Patterson, stepped forward with narrowed eyes. He glanced at the tag on her backpack, then at Sims, then down at the child with a disapproving squint. Something about her seemed off to him, though he couldn't have said what. Maybe it was the Polynesian name on the documents. Maybe it was the mix of ethnic features on her young face. Maybe it was her business class placement. Patterson asked for identification. Sims handed over the file. Dave flipped through the papers too quickly, making a show of squinting at the photo, then back at Laakea. His voice was even but sharp around the edges. He asked why a 5-year-old child had a business class ticket. Sims began to explain, but the tone shifted. Patterson questioned the document's authenticity, implying that something about the situation didn't add up. He made a comment, quiet but deliberate, about kids with made-up names and VIP bookings. Sims tried to protest, but Patterson was already flagging down another officer. His words were direct, rehearsed, and clinical. Possible fraud, child traveling unaccompanied, name and appearance don't match the booking expectations. The second officer took one look at the file and gave a nod. Sims, caught off guard and uncertain about the chain of authority, stepped back. In an instant, Laakea was no longer being escorted. She was being detained. She didn't cry at first. She didn't understand. But she knew enough to recognize when something was wrong. They led her to a separate seating area, away from the main flow of passengers. No one told her what was happening. No one called Ronda. Patterson asked her several questions rapid fire. Who paid for her ticket? Where was she going? Why was she flying alone? What did her name mean? She answered quietly, clutching her unicorn tighter with every word. The officers were not cruel, but they were dismissive, uninterested in the humanity behind her soft voice and wide eyes. One asked why her parents hadn't given her a normal name. Another asked why the mother's name on the form didn't match the credit card record. They couldn't verify the payment. Laakea's world, once filled with certainty and structure, became a blur of strange faces and suspicious glances. Her backpack was taken for inspection. Her unicorn was separated from her hands. Her lip began to tremble. By the time they began to question whether she was even legally traveling, her knees were pulled up to her chest on the bench and her arms wrapped around her shins. She rocked slightly, whispering her grandmother's name under her breath, as if invoking protection. Not once did anyone call the emergency contact number listed in bold on the front of her folder. Not once did anyone ask her calmly if she needed water or to use the bathroom. They didn't treat her like a child. They treated her like a threat too small to understand her own danger. And all of this happened under the glow of fluorescent lights and the dispassionate gaze of people who passed by without stopping. For them, she was a moment of curiosity, a tiny girl in the wrong place at the wrong time, surrounded by uniforms. And she was alone. But not for long. The hands of the terminal clock ticked forward, minute by minute, until Ronda Rousey's phone buzzed in the back pocket of her jeans. The message she received was simple. Delay. Escort changed. Situation unclear. Please contact Gate 2. The muscles in her neck tensed before her brain fully processed the words. She turned without thinking, feet already in motion, because when the world questioned her daughter's place in it, the mother who'd once fought in cages and arenas knew exactly how to respond, not with fists, but with the force of truth and the fire of unshakable love. And while Laakea sat trembling in that too-cold room, clutching her breath and trying not to cry, her mother was already on her way, ready to burn the whole system down if that's what it took to get her child back. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly as if responding to the shift in atmosphere. Laakea sat alone now in a sterile seating area meant for detained passengers, but her legs barely reached the edge of the chair. Her unicorn, once nestled protectively in her arms, had been confiscated and lay face down on a metal inspection table across the room, stripped of its pink ribbon and dignity. Her backpack had been unzipped and emptied, its contents splayed across a cold metal tray, a plastic sandwich container with heart-shaped stickers, a coloring book with half-finished pages, a rolled-up pair of socks, and a tiny, folded piece of paper with a heart scribbled in purple crayon. "Love you always, Mama." None of it seemed to matter to the men standing over it. Officer Dave Patterson had adopted a stance of casual authority, one hand on his hip, the other flipping through the contents of the child's bag as though searching for contraband in a criminal's suitcase. His colleague, Officer Ramirez, stood back with crossed arms, silent but complicit in the scene. She had already answered their questions twice, maybe 3 times, each time more softly, more hesitantly. "Where are you flying to?" "Seattle." "Who's meeting you?" "My grandma." "Who paid for your ticket?" "My mama." "What's her name?" "Ronda Rousey." "And who's that?" "She's my mom." The answers didn't change, but their reception did. Patterson's skepticism deepened with every repetition, twisting her words into suspicious echoes of themselves. He lifted the coloring book and flipped through it, pausing on a drawing of a woman with a ponytail and boxing gloves, standing with her arms raised over her head. "Looks like someone thinks her mom's a superhero," he muttered. Then, louder, for Ramirez to hear, "Bet this kid's seen one too many action movies." The comment wasn't meant for Laakea, but she heard it. She understood enough. Her lower lip trembled, and she clenched her small fists against her thighs. The bench was cold beneath her. She hadn't been offered anything to drink. No snack, no reassurance. And worse than anything, no one believed her. Julie, the original escort, had long since disappeared into another terminal, and no one had taken the time to check her schedule, her authorization, or even her identity. Patterson had dismissed her with a wave of the hand, claiming she'd abandoned her post, and therefore could not be trusted as a valid witness. No effort was made to verify the legitimacy of the escort transition. No one asked for surveillance footage. What they saw was a small girl with a big name and a suspiciously unshaken calm. In their eyes, that made her dangerous. They moved her to a smaller inspection room. She walked without resistance, her sneakers scuffing the floor, her hands now clenched tightly at her sides. Inside, a table and 2 chairs sat under a humming overhead light. A camera blinked quietly in the corner, but no one explained what it was recording. Patterson gestured for her to sit. She did. Ramirez remained standing. He pulled up her flight details on a tablet and began scrutinizing them. This name, Makalapuaokalanipu. What kind of name is that? He asked no one in particular. Is that even real? It's Hawaiian, Patterson said, his tone clipped with performative knowledge. Polynesian roots, a lot of vowels. Doesn't mean much to us, but they like their names long out there. She doesn't look Hawaiian, Ramirez added. She doesn't look like she belongs in business class either, Patterson replied with a half smirk. Neither man addressed her directly during that exchange. They spoke over her, around her, as though she were a puzzle to be solved rather than a human being deserving of respect. Their language was coated in a layer of suspicion so normalized that even they didn't recognize it as prejudice. They just thought they were being thorough. Lasakia shifted in her chair and spoke, her voice thin but steady. My mom is Ronda Rousey. Patterson looked at her, raising one brow. Fighter? She nodded. He chuckled. Sure she is, and I'm Batman. Ramirez laughed softly, shaking his head. This kid's got a wild imagination. It was in that moment that something in Laakea began to shift. She had held back tears for as long as she could, remembering her mother's words. Be brave, not loud. Be calm, not small. But now the ache in her chest wasn't just fear. It was humiliation, slow and creeping. They weren't just questioning her identity. They were mocking it. And with each smirk, each dismissive wave of the hand, each sideways glance, they reminded her that in their eyes, her name, her skin, her story didn't belong where she stood. Patterson picked up the small piece of paper from her backpack, the crayon note, and held it between 2 fingers. And what's this supposed to be? Laakea reached out instinctively. Please, that's from Mama. He didn't return it. Instead, he placed it on the table, flattening the corners as if to inspect it for secret codes. She blinked back a tear and folded her hands in her lap. That note, with its messy heart and uneven letters, had been the thing she had kissed before zipping her bag that morning. Her mother's love, crayon on paper. Outside the room, a low buzz of voices and movement indicated the flow of passengers moving toward the gates. Families reunited, travelers found their way to coffee stands, and over loudspeakers, flight numbers were called in steady cadence. But inside this room, time stretched. The air felt stagnant. The silence between questions grew longer, not softer. Then came the ultimate insult. Patterson left the room and returned a few minutes later with a female officer who introduced herself with a curt nod and a gloved hand. Routine screening, she announced. Laakea was told to step aside, remove her shoes, and stand with her arms slightly out. She obeyed. When the woman began patting her down, Laakea flinched. The gloves were cold, the touches impersonal. They searched the waistband of her leggings, her pockets, her tiny socks. She was 5 years old. Her eyes welled up again, and this time one tear escaped, tracing a slow line down her cheek. Once finished, the woman gave a nod. Clear. Patterson folded his arms. Guess she's not hiding anything. For now. Ramirez glanced at the tablet again. Still nothing matching on the credit card. Redacted name. She said her dad bought the ticket, Patterson added. Where's he? She said her mom did, Ramirez corrected. Well, it doesn't matter, Patterson said, annoyed. We've got no verification, no match, no response from the contact number. For all we know, this kid got handed a stolen ticket and a story. LaKia sat back down, curling into herself now, her breath hitching in quiet sobs she tried to suppress. They didn't see her as a child anymore. They saw her as a glitch in their system. An inconvenience. A potential problem to neutralize, not protect. And then, in a moment of bitter irony, Patterson opened the folder once again and noticed the emergency contact highlighted in red. Ronda Rousey. A phone number, a second number, a note in all caps. Mother will be on standby during flight boarding. He stared at it for a moment, frowning. I'll call it, Ramirez offered, but before he could, the doors to the room swung open. Julie had returned, red-faced, breathless, and furious. She had been searching for LaKia for nearly half an hour, redirected from one terminal to another. When she finally found out where the child had been taken, she demanded access and barreled through 2 security agents to get there. What is going on here? She snapped. Patterson straightened, surprised. She's 5, Julie shouted, pointing at LaKia, who had sat up straight at the sight of her original escort. She's 5 years old. You've had her in this room, interrogating her, searching her, treating her like a criminal. We were following protocol, Patterson mumbled, but the words rang hollow. Julie turned to LaKia and dropped to one knee. Sweetheart, are you okay? LaKia's eyes filled again, but she nodded slowly. Julie turned back to the officers, her tone sharper now. And did any of you call her mother, or even look at the highlighted instructions? Silence. I'm calling her now, Julie said, already pulling out her phone, and somewhere, not far from the terminal, Ronda Rousey was already sprinting down a corridor, her heart a clenched fist and her eyes ablaze with fury. By the time the call connected, she was less than 10 minutes away. 10 minutes from the room where her daughter sat, shoes off, cheeks tear-streaked, and dignity in pieces. 10 minutes from the officers who would soon learn that not every child is defenseless, especially when her mother has trained her whole life to break walls, rules, and bones if necessary. 10 minutes. It would be the longest 10 minutes of their careers. The airport corridors hummed with the steady rhythm of commerce and transit, of people moving with luggage in tow and destination on their minds, blissfully unaware that in a corner behind the bustle, a storm was quietly taking form. Inside the small holding room, the air had grown stale, the light too bright, the silence too thick. LaKia sat with her hands curled tightly into the sleeves of her hoodie, her back pressed against the plastic chair that creaked every time she shifted. Her legs dangled above the tiled floor, swinging slightly, a nervous rhythm her body created to distract itself from the humiliation lodged deep in her chest. Julie sat beside her now, her presence a small island of safety in the sterile discomfort of the room. She had tried to regain control of the situation, tried to assert her authority as the designated airline escort, but the damage had already been done. The officers hadn't apologized. They hadn't even acknowledged their overreach. Julie's arrival had simply prompted them to pause their interrogation and retreat behind protocol, leaving her to monitor the child while they reviewed the case with supervisors. In truth, they were buying time. The moment had become bigger than they anticipated. A phone call had already gone out. Julie had dialed Rhonda's number with shaking fingers, her voice tight with anger as she summarized what had happened. There had been no yelling from the other end, no questions, no confusion, only a quiet, measured promise. "I'm coming." And Julie had believed her. She had seen something in the way Lakia held herself, even at 5 years old. There was steel in her spine. That kind of strength was born, not taught, and it had Ronda Rousey's name written all over it. But while Julie sat with Lakia, brushing strands of hair gently out of the girl's face and whispering reassurances, Officer Patterson was across the terminal, explaining the situation to his supervisor in tones designed to obscure rather than clarify. He used words like suspicious, inconsistent, possible falsification, and unverified travel status. His language was technical, detached. The girl's age, her distress, her innocence, all flattened beneath a mountain of bureaucratic phrasing. The supervisor, a thin man named Charles Inman with neatly combed gray hair and a fondness for the rules, frowned at the report. "And you say the name on the booking is Makalapuao Kalanipu Brown?" Charles asked, scrolling through the notes on a screen. "Yes," Patterson said. "Booked in business class. Paid for with a redacted card. Name on the ID is long and odd. Doesn't match any frequent flyer records. Claimed her mother is Ronda Rousey, but there's no official record of that connection in our system." "Did you check emergency contact notes?" "It was there," Patterson admitted, "but it could be anyone using that name. We have to be cautious. People name-drop celebrities all the time." Charles rubbed his temples. "And you say the original escort left her with someone else?" "She handed her off to a replacement, which wasn't logged. That's another red flag." Charles sighed. "All right. For now, keep the child held until we can verify the payment method. We'll need the proof of identity beyond a handwritten note or a story about a famous mom." Meanwhile, Lakia remained unaware of these discussions. Her focus stayed fixed on her backpack, which had been placed on the table again, its contents only partially restored. Her unicorn was still missing a leg. The crayon note from her mother now had a smudge across the heart, and the rolled-up socks were no longer bundled the way she liked them. These tiny violations sat in the open like symbols of a dignity she couldn't defend. She didn't have the words. She only had the quiet ache of knowing she had been treated like she didn't belong. Julie noticed the shift in the child's posture. The swing of her feet had stopped. Her hands were clenched together, her lips pressed into a line. The silence wasn't passive anymore. It was protective. "I called your mom," Julie whispered gently. "She's coming, okay? She's almost here." Lakia didn't speak, but she gave a small nod. At that moment, outside the security zone, Ronda Rousey walked through the terminal with a pace that dared anyone to get in her way. Her face was bare. No makeup, no smile, and her eyes were laser-focused. She moved like someone who had trained her whole life to control fury and now allowed just enough of it to slip through the cracks. Her hands were steady, but her jaw clenched with every breath. She had left her car in a fire lane, ignored the shouted warnings of attendants, and bypassed every distraction that tried to slow her down. She reached the first checkpoint and showed her ID with one hand while dialing Julie with the other. When she got the room number, she didn't wait for directions. The airport staff barely had time to process who she was before she disappeared down the corridor. Back inside, Charles Inman had decided to take a look at the case himself. He walked into the holding room with practiced calm, clipboard in hand, the picture of administrative poise. He didn't greet Julie or Lakia at first. He simply observed the child for a long moment, as if looking at her hard enough might extract a confession. Then he took a seat and opened the folder in front of him. "We've had some concerns regarding your travel arrangements," he began, speaking slowly as if Laakea's age made her a liability in comprehension. "The ticket purchased under your name has a few irregularities. Business class is not typical for unaccompanied minors unless under special circumstance, and your listed guardian is not present. Your mother's name, as you've stated, is Ronda Rousey. However, our system shows no such connection, and the payment method is unverifiable." Julie opened her mouth to protest, but Charles raised a hand. "This is not an accusation, merely a procedural review." Laakea didn't understand all the words, but she heard the tone. Doubt. The kind that wrapped itself around her name like vines choking the truth. Charles continued, "Unless we can confirm these details, we cannot authorize your boarding. The airline reserves the right to suspend tickets pending fraud investigation. That includes holding you in temporary custody until legal guardianship is determined." At that precise moment, the door opened behind him. Ronda entered the room like a storm, wearing a calm disguise. She said nothing at first. She didn't need to. Her presence shifted the energy immediately. Even Charles, who had met countless frustrated passengers in his time, stood slowly, as if uncertain whether to offer a handshake or a defense. Laakea's face lit up with a mixture of relief and release. She didn't move, afraid that doing so might somehow delay the safety that had just walked through the door. Ronda crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter, taking her hands in hers. The touch said everything words couldn't. "You're safe. I'm here. No one's taken you from me." Charles cleared his throat. Miss Rousey, she corrected. Her voice was low, firm. "I want an explanation." Charles hesitated. "There were inconsistencies. The ticket. I bought that ticket." The cardholder information was redacted, and the unverified escort. "My daughter was handed off to someone you authorized. You failed to log the change. That's your mistake, not hers. I understand you're upset." "No," she said, standing now, rising to full height, her shoulders squared. "Upset is when someone spills coffee on your shirt. This," she pointed at her daughter, then at the torn backpack, the scattered belongings, the empty chair next to the now cold inspection table. "This is negligence. This is profiling. This is a 5-year-old girl treated like a criminal because her name doesn't fit your system and her skin doesn't fit your expectations." The room was silent. Charles tried to respond, but Ronda cut him off. "Do you know how many times I've been underestimated because of how I look? Because I don't act how I'm expected to? I've fought for respect my whole life. But she turned to Laakea. "She's not supposed to fight yet. She's supposed to fly, to dream, to grow up believing she's allowed to take up space in this world." Julie watched with tears building in her eyes. Charles finally found his voice. "The ticket will be reinstated, immediately. I'll personally ensure she boards with no further issue. And I will file a full report." "You'll do more than that," Ronda said. "You'll issue a public apology. You'll review your policies on unaccompanied minors. And you'll retrain every employee who thinks suspicion is a substitute for professionalism." He nodded, defeated. "Yes, ma'am." Ronda knelt again and looked Laakea in the eyes. "Ready to go home?" Laakea nodded. Then, for the first time since the ordeal began, she smiled, and Ronda thought to herself, "Not yet, but we're on our way." By the time Ronda and Laakea emerged from the small, suffocating inspection room, the air in the terminal had changed. What had once been a hum of daily routine, Boarding announcements, rolling luggage wheels, impatient murmurs from long security lines had grown tense with a different kind of energy. It started with the crowd that had gathered just outside the frosted glass partition. Some had been there when Ronda entered, and others had trickled in after recognizing her. But what drew them wasn't fame. It was presence. That unmistakable pressure in the air that came with someone refusing to be silent. Phones had risen like sunflowers to light, not in celebration, but in instinct. The way people film car crashes or sudden fights in public, they had recorded her not because they admired her, but because they sensed something about to break. And something had. It wasn't just the confrontation in the back room that had been caught on video. A teenage traveler, seated near the holding area charging her phone, had captured footage of La Akia being led by the wrist towards security. The footage showed her pink backpack dangling off one shoulder, her unicorn under one arm, her head bowed not in guilt but confusion. Another clip showed her sitting silently, staring at the ground while two officers stood over her. The third video, the one that would later lead the headlines, began just as Ronda's voice, steady and full of measured rage, rang out. This is a 5-year-old girl treated like a criminal because her name doesn't fit your system. The clips spread fast. Within an hour, they had been posted on multiple platforms: Reddit, TikTok, X, Instagram, even Tumblr, which no one had expected to become relevant again. The captions varied in tone, but shared the same underlying message. Ronda Rousey confronts airport staff over racial profiling of her daughter. Some posts used the word profiling, others said discrimination. A few said injustice. But they all agreed on one thing. Something had gone very wrong. And Ronda had walked in just in time to say what no one else had the power or courage to say. At first, the airport staff tried to contain the fallout. Charles Inman was ushered into a private operations room to debrief upper-level managers, who had been alerted the moment the videos began to circulate. The legal team drafted a preliminary statement within 45 minutes, something vague and sterile. We are aware of the incident involving a passenger and our security team. A review is underway to determine whether policies were followed appropriately. But the statement only added fuel to the fire. By then, the internet was already doing what it did best: digging. They found La Akia's full name on boarding records, matched her last name to Ronda's public family tree, and located an old Instagram photo from 2 years ago showing Ronda and Travis holding her in matching jiu-jitsu jais. The caption read, "Our warrior princess, La Akea Makalapuaokalanepu, brave, bright, and already submitting her teddy bear in arm bars." That photo was now everywhere, juxtaposed with the grainy screenshots of a small girl being surrounded by officers, her backpack gaping open, her face unreadable. When Ronda exited the secure zone with La Akea at her side, the airport had begun to stir with controlled panic. Staff whispered into walkie-talkies. Agents stared at screens, not flight manifests but trending dashboards. The name Ronda Rousey had jumped into the top 5 trending searches in North America, and the keyword LAX incident wasn't far behind. Julie walked with them as far as she was allowed, her face pale with concern and her voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to try to sweep this," she said, "but they can't. Not anymore. People saw, people know." Ronda didn't answer at first. She walked with her hand on her daughter's shoulder, guiding her with quiet authority through the familiar chaos of the terminal. Her mind was already several steps ahead, considering calls to her lawyer, to Travis, to her PR team, but most of all to the part of herself that had always relied on instinct more than strategy. Right now, her instinct was telling her that this wasn't just about her daughter anymore. This was about every child whose name was questioned, whose seat was challenged, whose right to exist in a space of dignity was stolen by someone who mistook control for judgment. At the gate, a supervisor who hadn't been there earlier approached them with the cautious posture of someone trained to apologize professionally. He had a soft voice, a laminated name tag, and a deeply uncomfortable expression. "Miss Rousey," he began, "your daughter's ticket has been reinstated. The boarding gate has been notified. She will receive priority clearance, and we've added her to our child companion watch list. Additionally, we'd like to offer—" "I'm flying with her," Ronda said flatly. I understand. We can put us together," she said. "Whatever seat, doesn't matter." The supervisor nodded and typed something into his handheld device. "It'll be done immediately." Behind them, a man in a dress shirt and rolled-up sleeves approached carefully. He identified himself as a public liaison officer for the airline and offered to escort them personally. Ronda looked at him once, then past him, at the small crowd forming near the gate. Passengers who had recognized her, or who had seen the videos on their phones and now stared not with awe, but with a strange blend of discomfort and solidarity. Lakea clutched her mother's hand more tightly. Ronda lowered her voice. "We walk through quietly. No press, no statements. She boards in peace." The liaison nodded. "Understood." As I moved towards the gate, the boarding agent stepped aside without a word. Her eyes were wide and uncertain. Ronda didn't speak to her. She didn't need to. The expression on her face said everything the woman might have needed to hear. Lakea stepped onto the bridge to the plane, her unicorn hugged to her chest once more. Someone had reattached the leg with tape. She didn't ask who. She just held it close and didn't let go. On board, the flight crew had clearly been briefed. A senior flight attendant greeted them with a warm but subdued smile and offered them a seat in the front row of business class. "Miss Rousey, Miss Brown, we're so sorry for the trouble. Anything you need, you let us know." Ronda helped Lakea into her seat, buckled her in, then sat down beside her. The hum of the cabin was quiet. Most of the other passengers were already seated. A few stole glances, but no one said a word. Whether from fear or respect, it didn't matter. Silence, for once, was a kindness. Once the plane took off, Lakea leaned her head against Ronda's arm and asked quietly, "Is it going to be on TV?" Ronda took a deep breath and answered truthfully, "Maybe." "Will they say bad things?" "Some might. But a lot of people will say good things too, people who know the truth." Lakea was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "Did I do something wrong?" Ronda turned fully to her and took both of her daughter's small hands in her own. "You did everything right. They were wrong, not you." Outside the airplane, the clouds parted gently as the aircraft descended above the chaos. Inside, Ronda finally allowed her breath to slow. She knew this wasn't over. Once they landed, there would be calls and meetings, a public apology to demand, maybe lawsuits to file. But right now, her daughter was beside her, safe, breathing, whole. That was what mattered. But elsewhere, on feeds, timelines, inboxes, and comment sections, a very different flight was taken off. Advocates, parents, lawyers, teachers, and strangers began sharing the story. Celebrities retweeted the clips. Journalists began calling the airline. Statements were written, then rewritten. And somewhere in the middle of it all, someone wrote, "If Ronda Rousey's child can be treated like this, what happens to the kids whose parents don't have millions of followers?" The question spread like wildfire. The network had exploded, and now the world was watching. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time the plane sliced through the clouds above Washington State, casting long amber beams through the oval windows of the aircraft. Inside the quiet cabin of business class, the hum of flight had lulled most passengers into a state of half-sleep, their minds drifting somewhere between altitude and exhaustion. But in seat 2A, Laakea sat upright, wide awake, one hand resting lightly on the stuffed unicorn in her lap. A thin strip of adhesive tape bound the toy's hind leg, still fragile from its recent injury. Her other hand, smaller than the headset she refused to wear, was tucked under the blanket that had been carefully wrapped around her by the flight attendant earlier in the flight. Beside her, Ronda watched her daughter with quiet intensity. She had not closed her eyes once since the plane had taken off from LAX. Her mind moved with a fighter's precision, measuring the breath of the moment, the pulse of her child's recovery, and the ache of what had unfolded. Every detail of the day lingered in her body like bruises after a fight. The dismissal, the suspicion, the language that reduced her daughter's presence to a problem, a policy violation, a thing to be fixed rather than a person to be respected. Ronda had traveled countless times in her life. She had boarded planes bruised, boarded planes as a champion, boarded planes to fight and to mourn. But never had she boarded a plane carrying so much quiet fury. Not even her fiercest opponents had stirred in her what that room back at the airport had. Seeing her 5-year-old daughter stared at like she was less than whole, less than safe, less than real. Laakea didn't speak much after takeoff, but she had held her mother's hand with quiet persistence, as if making sure Ronda wouldn't disappear too. When the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dimmed, the first-class attendant had offered drinks and snacks, all declined except for apple juice and a small bag of pretzels that now sat unopened on the tray table. There was a moment, halfway through the flight, when Laakea shifted slightly and pulled the small note card from her backpack. The heart, drawn in purple crayon, still smudged from earlier. She held it up as if to inspect whether love could really be bent or bruised without breaking. She didn't say anything, but her thumb ran gently over the shape. Then, without a word, she tucked it back into the sleeve of her unicorn's ribbon, like a secret being returned to its hiding place. Ronda's voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "Let me see your hands." Laakea hesitated but unwrapped them from the blanket. Thin red marks still trailed along the insides of her palms and wrists from the security search. Nothing deep, but enough to burn like insults that no one saw. Ronda reached into the side pocket of her jacket and pulled out the same travel-sized first aid kit she carried to every tournament. She dabbed gently at the scratches with a disinfecting wipe, her movements slow and steady. Laakea didn't flinch. "I should have gotten there sooner," Ronda murmured. "I should have stopped it before it got that far." "You came," Laakea said softly. "That's what matters." Her voice carried the kind of certainty that only children possess, an unconditional belief in the people they love, even when the world proves complicated and unkind. Ronda smiled faintly and kissed the back of her daughter's hand. "You know," she said after a pause, "when I was your age, I used to think people like that couldn't hurt me. I thought if I trained hard enough, won enough, made a name for myself, they'd have to respect me. But it doesn't always work that way. Some people don't listen until you force them to." Laakea nodded. "Like when you fight." "Sometimes," Ronda said, "but sometimes fighting isn't about fists. It's about standing still. It's about saying no. It's about holding your ground when someone tries to erase your name." The girl was silent for a while, staring out the window at the shifting light that painted the clouds gold. Her reflection blinked back at her in the glass, thoughtful and tired. "Is it okay to be mad?" she asked finally. "Yes," Ronda answered. "It's okay to be mad. You're allowed to feel everything. What happened to you was wrong. And when something's wrong, feeling mad means you know it in your bones." Laakea thought about this for a long moment. Then she looked down at the unicorn's taped leg again. "Can we get her fixed?" "We can," Ronda said, "but we'll keep the tape for now. A reminder." "Of what?" "That even broken things are still yours. That when people try to take your story from you, you don't have to let them." The words settled over the space between them like a soft blanket. Laakea nodded and reached for the apple juice, taking a careful sip. As the plane began its slow descent into Seattle, the flight attendant returned to their row and handed Ronda a small folded piece of paper. "Ma'am, this was printed from the gate. It's the airline's formal apology. They said to give it to you personally." Ronda took it, unfolded it once, and read the brief, calculated paragraphs. It was polite, almost sterile. There was an acknowledgement of the delay, an expression of regret, and a vague commitment to future review. It was the kind of statement that said little but suggested much, carefully worded to avoid admission of wrongdoing. She folded it again without a word and slipped it into her bag. At baggage claim, they were greeted not only by Laakea's grandmother, but by a growing number of journalists and curious bystanders who had tracked the flight's arrival online. The airport staff had set up barriers, but the perimeter was loose. As Ronda stepped off the escalator, holding Laakea's hand firmly in hers, a few camera flashes went off. One reporter called out a question. "Miss Rousey, do you think what happened was racial profiling?" Ronda didn't answer. She didn't slow down. She kept walking until she reached her mother-in-law, who immediately knelt and opened her arms. Laakea ran into them, holding tight, face buried in her grandmother's neck. Only then did Ronda stop. She turned to face the cameras. No podium, no script, just her. "My daughter is 5 years old," she said. "She had a valid ticket, full documentation, and the right to travel safely. She was detained, interrogated, and humiliated because someone decided she didn't look like she belonged in business class. That's not just a mistake, that's a message sent to every child who has ever been told that their name, their skin, or their silence makes them suspicious." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "If she weren't my daughter," Ronda continued, "if she weren't connected to a name people know, would you even be here asking questions? How many kids go through this every day without cameras, without lawyers, without backup? You want to talk about what happened? Talk about them too." She paused and looked toward the line of arrivals now watching in respectful silence. "This isn't about me. This is about dignity. Hers, yours, everyone's, and I won't stop talking until the people in charge start listening." Then she turned back to her family, took her daughter's hand again, and walked away from the noise. The headlines came quickly. Articles ranged from outrage to analysis. Opinion columns dissected every moment, every word. Social media flooded with solidarity posts from parents, activists, teachers, even fellow athletes. Celebrities lent their voices. Airlines scrambled to issue secondary statements. Policy consultants began to draft proposals. Lawyers reached out to offer assistance pro bono for families who had faced similar injustices. In just days, a fire had been lit, and the fuel had been a child with a name too long for their forms. But Laakea didn't care about any of that. She sat that night curled beside her grandmother, a soft fleece blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her unicorn still in her arms. On the end table next to her sat a fresh notebook, the cover decorated with stickers and glitter. The first page bore her name, written in bold letters, each vowel carefully printed, La'akea Makalapuao Kalanipu Brown. Below it, in smaller letters, was a line she had asked her mother to help her write, "My name is mine. It is not a mistake." And that was how she claimed her place in the world, not by fighting louder, but by standing still, wrapped in warmth, dignity, and the memory of being believed. The next morning, the world still spun. Planes still took off. Security lines still crawled forward, but somewhere in the system, a ripple remained. A name had been spoken. A child had been seen. And a mother had reminded everyone watching that silence is not safety. Sometimes dignity begins not with victory, but with refusal. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply not back down. La'akea didn't fly again for a while, but when she did, she packed her unicorn, her notebook, and her name, and walked to the gate like she belonged there. Because she did. She always had. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more like it. Watch the next video to hear another powerful story that deserves to be told. And if you think someone needs to see this, share it. It might matter more than you know.